So here's a good list for you of what has basically become the A to Z of Brexit. So A is for Anglo-Irish relationship. And this is a quote from the then Vote Leave press secretary, Theresa Villas. So, nor is there any prospect of security checks returning to the border. The common travel area between the UK and Ireland predates our EU membership and will outlast it. The unique status Irish citizens are accorded in the UK predates the EU membership and will outlast it. There is no reason why the UK's only land border should be any less open after Brexit than it is today. And we now know that once again was a giant lie, and you can't have that unless you are, well, prepared to secure things, and, well, the Leavers certainly aren't prepared for that. So B is for billions. 39 of them, to be precise. That's the cost of exiting the European Union. Hard Brexiteers such as Dominic Raab like to kid on that we won't be paying Brussels a penny if we leave without a deal. Just the kind of gung-ho statement you'd expect from the man who only recently realised that Dover was an important trading port. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer says that we will have to pay a big chunk, deal or no deal. C is for Cameron. Perhaps fittingly, Brexit began with a lie that accidentally came true. David Cameron's 2015 manifesto promised a second referendum and was designed to keep Tory EU haters happy. He assumed he'd be blocked by Liberal Democrat coalition partners, and when he went and won a majority, which is why C is also for catastrophe, Cameron also promised he would stay on as PM if Leave won, and he quit, obviously, immediately. D is for Daily Mail. The Mail, under past editor Paul Darcy, spread more lies about the EU than any other newspaper. But between them, the Telegraph, the Sun and the Express, and the creativity of journalism around our relationship with Europe has been exceptional. From excessively curved bananas to milk jugs being banned, from euro notes making you impotent to cows being forced to wear nappies and Bombay Mix having to be renamed, our press has waged a decades-long campaign to ridicule the EU. But who's looking ridiculous now? E is for election. There isn't going to be one. It isn't going to happen. Then it's not going to be a general election. So said Theresa May's spokesman on March 2017. A month later, with a soaring 41% approval ratings, she reluctantly told the nation that a vote was necessary to strengthen her hand in EU negotiations. She lost her majority, throwing the entire process into the abject state of chaos that is Britain today. F is for Fox. International Secretary Liam Fox told us the idea of a glorious global Britain, once again creating new waves of international trading and prosperity. The quote from him is, "The free trade agreement we will do should be the one of the easiest in human history." F is also for, well, F is for one big idiot. F can also be for Farage as well. One of the greatest litany of untruths and outright liars is told by the self-styled Mr. Brexit, and perhaps the most heinous was his breaking point poster, a moment when his xenophobia transcended his usual dog-whistling status into outright blatant racism. G is for Grove. The day after we vote to leave, he said, "We hold all the cards. We can choose the path we want. Take a bow, Michael Grove." 32 months later, and Britain is still hopelessly lost. No Brexit pathway in sight. H is for health tourism. One of the dog whistle scares sold to readers by the Daily Mail, the Sun and the Express during and in the run-up to the referendum. And it was extraordinary cost of so-called health tourism. People travelling to the UK solely for the benefit of our generous health system. In the case of EU citizens, this is a total fabrication. The truth is that British citizens in the EU receive 5 more times the value of treatment than we give to EU citizens here. H is also for hell, and it's going to be a crowded place if Donald Tusk is correct. I is for immigration. The idea that countries within the EU have no control over immigration is a lie. We do. But we chose not to exercise it. Tony Blair removed border checks you see in almost every other European country in 1998. That means we have no way of knowing who was still in the UK and who had left. Under the existing rules, EU member states can send nationals home after 3 months if they haven't found a job or cannot support themselves. We could enforce that, keeping only those who actively contribute to our economy. Theresa May, as Home Secretary, chose not to. J is for Johnson, and where to begin? At the beginning, perhaps, when Boris and the great charlatan first flipped the Leave side, saying there will continue to be free trade and access to the single market. Boris Johnson in the Telegraph of the 26th of June 2006. And K is for Knucklehead, aka David Davis. David Davis came close to contempt proceedings for his blasé way he bluffed and blagged his way through his time as the Brexit Secretary. Notably, he assured Parliament that his department was creating a detailed impact assessment of Brexit effect on the British economy. He later confessed to the Select Committee that this was untrue, and in fact, no impact assessments had been done at all. It all went late to the Vote Leave organiser Dominic Cummings' assessment of him, of saying he was thick as mince, lazy as a toad, and vain as Narcissus. And L is for Lord Digby Jones. Not a single job would be lost because of Brexit, the ex-CIB boss and former lawyer told us before the referendum. 2 years later, he was standing by it, falling back on the statement, the difference between Brexit and either uncertainty around Brexit. Either way, thousands of jobs have already been repatriated to the continent, and the government impact assessments forecast a 9.3% hit to the economy under a no deal. M is for May. Only Donald Trump tops May's comfort with leadership in our post-truth age. The central unforgivable lie that she propagates is that she's acting in the national interest in delivering the will of the people, when she is, in fact, the first British PM in our history to knowingly pursue a policy that will damage the nation. Brexit has already cost 2% in lost predicted growth, and each household is now £900 poorer than it would have been if they had voted to remain. And according to the Bank of England, nobody voted to be poorer. Oh yes, they did. They just didn't know it at the time. N is for NHS. Once we've settled our accounts, we will be able to take back control of roughly 350 million per week. It would be a fine thing, as many of us have pointed out, if a lot of the money went to the NHS. So wrote Boris Johnson in the Daily Telegraph, and then he went and plastered it on massive letters across a bus and drove it across the country. The rest is history. O is for opportunists. Vote Leave's statement 2 weeks before the referendum. After we vote to leave, we would immediately be able to start negotiating new trade deals with emerging economies and the world's biggest economies, citing the US, China and Japan, as well as Canada, Australia, South Korea and New Zealand, and so on, which could enter into force immediately after the UK leaves the EU. And of course we know that was a massive lie. And of course Japan recently concluded one of the world's biggest free trade agreements with the EU, and as for us, we're still waiting. P, there is no P, the politicians took it. Q is for queues, not for food yet, but for lorries. Hopeless Transport Secretary Chris Grayling told Question Time in March last year, we will maintain a free-flowing border at Dover. We will not impose checks on the port. The only reason we would have queues at the border is if we put in place restrictions that created those queues. We are not going to do that. It's a lie. The Financial Times reported that lorry checks under a no deal taking as little as 80 seconds would result in unrecoverable backlog of lorries, and the government itself is planning to turn the M20 into a lorry park. And R is for Rees-Mogg. No shortage here, but perhaps one of the most fully that demonstrates Rees-Mogg's capacity for Manipulative, cynical lying was when he conspired with Steve Baker to accuse the floor of the Commons, the civil service, from the floor of the Commons, the civil service of trying to scupper Brexit. Baker later apologised. Rees-Mogg, characteristically, has never done so. S is for single market. Absolutely nobody is talking about threatening our place in the single market, said Daniel Hannan, Brexiteer MP before the referendum. And of course, who is now championing to threaten our place in the single market? Well, you know exactly who. T is for taking back control, the greatest lie of them all. Quite possibly, the hypnotic mantra was perfect for its audience, millions who quite rightly felt disenfranchised or anxious for their future. But lack of control over the EU wasn't the issue. It was lack of control over a Westminster programme of austerity set by George Osborne. U is for union. If we vote to leave, I think the union will be stronger. I think when we vote to leave, it will be clearer than having voted to leave one union to the last thing people of Scotland want to do is to break up another. Michael Grove on the BBC on the 8th of May 2016. V is Vote for Leave, otherwise known as the Lie Central, the official campaign body for exiting the EU, delivering a wonderful lay of deceit, including the following. EU supporters say we must have access to the single market, but Britain will have access to the single market after we vote to leave. The idea that our trade will suffer is silly. Let's give our NHS the 350 million a week that the EU takes. Taxpayers should be spent on filling potholes in Britain rather than being squandered on foreign bridges. If you are still wondering what it would look like after we came out, think about this. Lower taxes as a result of no longer having to pay into the EU budget. Sorry, that's rather funny. The list is endless, and it is completely a litany of rubbish. W is for will of the people. It's not now. It has, it's debatable that if it ever was. Last polling suggests that 45% of people now want to remain versus the 35% who want to leave, and 22% now remain undecided. Even in the referendum itself, only 37% of the electorate actually voted to leave. The rest either voted to remain or not at all. So, some will of the people. X is for xenophobia. In 2014, Nigel Farage laid out the line. If you said to me, would I like to see over the next 10 years a further 5 million people coming to Britain, and if that happened, we'd all be slightly richer, I'd say I'd rather we weren't slightly richer. In March 2017, if Brexit is a disaster, I will go and live abroad. I will go live somewhere else. Such principles from Nigel as usual. Y is for youth vote. More than 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds, the generation who will have to live longest with Brexit than any other, voted to remain. And by the time March 29th comes around, and we leave the EU, which obviously this was written after before that, around 1.4 million young people will be of voting age. The idea that Brexit is the will of the people is a dangerous lie. Z is for zombie government. Theresa May leads a government trapped between two warring factions. One side, the hard Brexiteers led by Jacob Rees-Mogg, and on the other, the sane side. Any precedence that the government is in control of the Brexit negotiations is long dead. Meanwhile, all domestic failings centred around George Osborne's 8 years of austerity, the failings that in large part caused Brexit in the first place, continue to drift unaddressed. Whatever solution to Brexit we arrive at, it is that it will be a legacy, a country more divided, fractious and disappointed ever before in our no more ever before in our history. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the A to Z of Brexit.